You're listening to Why We Do What We Do.
Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your eternally sad host, Abraham.
And I am your completely infuriated host, Shane.
We're a psychology podcast. We talk about the things that people do, the things that people have done, and why they do them, and unpack in the most scientific way that we can what is going on in these situations, because we find it interesting and we find it valuable to sometimes understand what's happening around us, as well as take retrospectives on things that have happened in the past and maybe why that took place. And that's what we do.
You know, every now and again, we'll do a history episode, and this is one of those history episodes, but it's a history of behavior that is completely aberrant. You know, something that has long-lasting ramifications, unfortunately.
Yes. Let's start with some of the lighter things that we like to do. First, we know that this is going to be a longer topic because just how vast the notes were and putting together the research for us to record this episode. So the first part of this is going to come out on August 23rd. So if you're listening on the day that this publishes, happy Cuban Sandwich Day.
Yeah. Also, happy Ride the Wind Day. So I assume that's for sailing.
Actually, no, I believe that this has to do a lot more with skydiving.
Like that?
And aviation as well.
Oh, big fan of that. That makes more sense, I think.
Speaking of things that are full of air, it is National Sponge Cake Day.
Oh, big fan of that. It's also Kobe Bryant's birthday. So happy birthday, Black Mamba.
Yes. So remembering Kobe Bryant. And so, yeah, those are holidays to celebrate. August 23rd is actually one of the lighter ones on terms of all the holidays going on. Usually we have there's a lot more.
Yeah, I was going to say there's usually like quite a few more. So it's shocking that there's less, but maybe because people are too busy going back to school.
There's that. There's, I think, in recognition and honor of Kobe Bryant might be why. That's not why.
Yeah.
Anyway, we'll say that that's why, just for fun.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, getting into today's topic, I can talk. I would like to issue at the very top of this a trigger warning. We are going to be talking about monstrous abuse of humans, brutality, violence, rape, child abuse, all of those sorts of things ahead. So, although we try and handle this as well as we can in terms of it not being about exploitation, it not being about graphic depictions of these sorts of violence, it is virtually unavoidable in a topic like this. And so if that's something you're uncomfortable listening to, you might want to move on. However, if you're in Florida, you might consider this mandatory listening because you're not going to hear it anywhere else.
Yeah, that's true. It's being taken out of a lot of curricula, and then what's being replaced is with something called PragerU. So let's go ahead and avoid that place if you can.
Definitely. All right. Before we jump into this, finally, a quick thing is if you'd like to support the show, you can head over to wherever you're listening to this and subscribe. You can leave us a rating and review. You can join us on Patreon. You can pick up some merch at our merch store. You can vote for us. Speaking of which, the People's Choice Podcast Awards are coming to a close, I believe, September 9th. And so if you have the chance and you can go vote, we made it through the first round. We are officially an award-nominated podcast. Thank you so much to everyone who has voted.
Yeah.
But if you can go through and vote for us for the final round, we would appreciate that. And even if we do not win, we were just honored to be nominated. So thank you all for the people who have nominated us for that position. So those are the ways you can support us. I'll talk more about that at the end of this discussion. Now, I did my best to pull a Shane here. I don't know. I did not do it as well. But the question I'll start with is, what does Hitler, the Bible, IQ tests, and Mesopotamia have in common?
That's pretty good.
Thank you.
I like it.
The things they have in common is this episode, but we'll unpack why.
Yes. So did we announce what we're talking about yet? Did we say what we were talking about?
We haven't.
Okay.
No, just that it was terrible.
Whew. Okay, so today we are talking about the history of slavery. So this is going to be a sensitive topic for folks. So we already kind of issued the trigger warning, but we're going to do our best to give this the depth and respect that it deserves. Given that it has impacted so many people, we will try to introduce a little bit of levity here and there because it is such a heavy topic, but please know that we are approaching this with the utmost respect for the people that are impacted by this particular thing. So we don't want you to think that we're trying to walk away from this kind of blowing this off as like a goofy thing. We do absolutely understand the impact of this and really want to give it the time it deserves.
Yes. So we'll start with that quick definition to make sure you're clear on which type of slavery we're talking about. This is a term that is used multiple ways, arguably and sensitively the second way, but we're not getting into that. That is a way that people use it. So it functions that way. So slavery is the practice of owning a person as if they were property, especially for compulsory unpaid labor. Thus, by definition, a slave does not have similar rights as a non-enslaved person. But the other kind of slavery we're not talking about is sort of excessive, unwavering devotion to a cause. We're just talking about the practice of owning a person.
Yeah, we're not talking about the idea of like being a slave to your job. We are talking about literally being a slave, being property to somebody else.
Right. Yes, exactly.
So all available evidence and the logic of sociological conditions of a small communal group suggest that hunter and gatherer tribes never practiced slavery. So that was not a thing that happened in early human groups.
Right.
However, slavery still predates recorded history. So the first written reference to slavery was found in the Mesopotamian Code of Hammurabi, which described the practice as having been going on for thousands of years prior to that society.
It is believed that the practice may have originated in Sumer of Sumeria and then spread to Greece. The historians are unclear when slavery made its way to places like India and China, although it was much, much later than that. Specifically, the Qin, Qin dynasty in 221 BC for China, and probably later than that for India. As there were not, the reason that they look at this is that they were looking at the written language, and there's not even a Sanskrit word that could be translated to mean slave. So that's part of their evidence for why slavery likely did not exist prior to that.
Yeah. Now, in ancient times, slavery was not really a business. It came about for a variety of reasons. It was either an issue of debt, it was a child who was abandoned, it was a result of war, like prisoners of war were often included in that. Maybe folks were born into a family of enslaved peoples, or it was a punishment for a crime. So there were kind of social expectations around this, or social, I don't want to say norms, but there were social rules around what slavery was that wasn't like an economics thing just yet.
Yeah, you're exactly right. From about 500 to 1500 CE, the humans were starting to globalize a lot. And there was war, conquering, and colonization, which expanded from regional conflicts to now, for the first time, these multi-continental campaigns. And the people that were conquered, if you scare quotes, conquered, taken, whatever, they were invaded and whatnot. These people were frequently forced into slave labor by their captors.
Yes. So in the 1400s, the Roman Catholic Church, of course it's the Catholic Church, granted a monopoly on trade in Africa to the Portuguese and granted Spain the right to, quote, conquer the new world, end quote. There's probably going to be a day where we're just going to have to do our best to take down the Catholic Church because I feel like they are at the center of so many problems. Like so many problems.
It is a sordid past. So the church granted this monopoly on trade. What they specifically said here to the people of Portugal with respect to their trade in Africa, the church gave Portugal permission to raid, pillage, and plunder Africa and to, quoting the church here, reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, end quote. So that was part of the charter that they were granted.
Ugh. Okay, so ironically, Queen Isabella of Spain instructed Christopher Columbus to not enslave natives he found in the New World as they were to be Spanish subjects. So just to be clear, Christopher Columbus, head, decided to ignore that and go ahead and do it anyway.
It's true. Yeah. Everywhere the people were sailing away from under the banner of the Roman Catholic Church, they were enslaving people. Is basically what happened there.
Also, the gall and the arrogance of the Catholic Church to be like, yes, you can go do this all over the world without any sort of accounting for like what other peoples of the world felt about that, which I imagine most people would be like, I don't want this. But they were like, we're the Catholic Church. We rule above all else.
Right. Yeah. Now, there were kind of multiple sources that were huge movers in terms of pushing slavery into be a economic system and really explode in how widespread it was. One of the people you could point to is King Charlemagne, in particular, who was nearly single-handedly responsible for creating a global slave trade. He was not the only one, but he was very, very importantly influential.
Definitely had a hand on the wheel.
He had a hand on the wheel, yeah. His unification of West and Central Europe was funded in part by the practice of capturing people and selling them into slavery to the highest bidder. Between that and the Holy War between Christians and Muslims, and Viking raids that found profitability in also capturing and selling people into slavery. Many people across Europe and the Middle East were forced into slavery kind of across lines, and they were shipped to the opposing respective country. And because this largely happens to people that were vulnerable populations that were relatively easy to capture and hold, it was largely women and children. So you had Muslim women and children being captured and sent as slaves to Europe. You had European women and children who were being captured and sold as slaves to people in the Middle East. It was just an ugly, gross disaster.
Yes. And at this point in time, Asian countries such as India and China had started enslaving tons of people. Primarily, they enslaved Jewish people, and Europeans in India and China did the same exact, except also enslaved people from other neighboring countries. And all of them went after indigenous tribes and peoples all over the place. So, like, it was essentially a practice that took othering to another level, right? They were like, oh, you are different than me. You belong to me now. You're going to do work for me to benefit me.
Right. Yeah, very much this level of subjugation. And as we said, I think just this important part here is the people that they were likely to try and grab for slaves were the people that were going to have the toughest time defending themselves. And so it was a lot of people who had physical disabilities or potentially probably some amount of mental disabilities, and then women and children. Like, they obviously would capture anybody that they could capture. There was lots of people who were not those populations, but the easiest people for them to grab and force into slavery were more vulnerable populations, which takes what is already a horrific practice and makes it even grosser, like,
right.
Just really sad. So shortly after systematic colonization/genocide began in the Americas, the new people practiced indentured servitude. So the new people who were coming over and appropriating lands from the native inhabitants were practicing this indentured servitude, which, for those of you who don't remember from history course or have never heard that term, indentured servitude is compulsory unpaid labor until presumably some debt is considered paid off. Like, someone might say, please grant me passage to this place. And then someone would then pay for them to immigrate to their country, and payment for that immigration, they would have that person work on their property until they felt that that debt had been paid off. Now, they might say that, like, you make, next to nothing, and so it's going to take the rest of your life for that debt to be paid off, therefore making it functionally equivalent to just all other types of slavery. They may also make it so that the debt was so high that it would take the rest of their life to pay off, even if they were paid normal wages. So there are lots of ways to manipulate that system, but that was essentially what indentured servitude looked like when it began in the Americas.
Another thing they would do, too, is that while that person was in debt and kind of working in that space, they would charge them for things like certain meals or clothing or materials that they needed. And so that would add to the debt. So, like, their debt would get extended because they would essentially create a credit line where your payment was just your labor.
Yes, yeah.
And they would just make it impossible to get out of that.
Yeah, really good catch. And I meant to say, but I'm glad you interrupted with that because that was a really important piece. But as we're setting the context here for what is going to be, I think, the crux of this discussion, the primary heart of what we're talking about, because we're talking about, like, as people started to immigrate to the Americas, and as I said, they're sort of committing genocide and taking over and appropriating lands. By about the 1600s, indentured servitude was really rapidly disappearing as a practice. And that was really important for what came next. And before we move on to that, we'll have to listen to what has come about from all this colonization, which is late stage capitalism. Here are some ads. Okay, we're back. So we're setting the context now for what happened when indentured servitude started to go away.
Now, in 1619, the São João Bautista, a Portuguese slave ship, arrived at Angola, South Africa, and attacked and arrested innocent people from the Ndongo and Congo kingdoms. The slavers roughly packed these people into the hull of the ship, and you can actually, I don't know if you talk about this later, but, like, there's pictures and schematics of how folks were packed into these ships. It is so inhumane. It's awful.
Yeah, actually, we need to spend a few minutes on that. So As you sort of alluded to, the conditions of slavery had almost certainly been horrible and disgusting and inhuman by its very design and since its inception, right? However, by the time the slave trade started becoming this global thing, and in particular, when it started requiring these months-long sea voyages, the conditions of slavery became just legendarily abhorrent on these ships. Let's unpack a little bit what they were having to deal with in being transported in this condition on these slave ships.
So many times, a lot of the folks that were captured and enslaved, the enslaved folks were often shackled together. They were placed inside the hull. They were often laying down horizontally. They could not stand. They were not usually given very much to eat, if anything at all. They were not clothed very well. It was just, it's the worst possible condition you could think of. That's how folks were kept. They were essentially kept like cargo.
Yeah.
And they were treated like cargo. A lot of the enslaved folks were kept as essentially just crates inside the hull of the ship. They were not attended to. They were left alone. And then when somebody would pass away, they would throw them overboard. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit as well.
So yeah, just as you said, they were stripped naked for inspection and often just kind of left that way. They were so cramped and packed together that, as you said, they were forced to crouch or even just lie down. They had very little ventilation, so this was just the opposite of sanitation and also made it extremely hot. And they were kept below deck for 2 to 3 months of the entire journey, maybe brought up just to get a little bit of exercise, a little bit of food, maybe. But there was these rampant diseases such as smallpox and dysentery were extremely common, and apparently was so foul-smelling that it was just vomit-inducing.
Right. Women and children were kept separate, but were regularly abused and raped by the crew, and the hostages were given 2 small meals per day, and if they refused, they were force-fed, and the dead were thrown overboard. Sometimes, not only were the dead thrown overboard, but the group that they were chained to were also thrown overboard.
Man.
So sometimes what would happen is that person who had passed would be thrown overboard and drag over other folks they were shackled to.
This thing about this disposal of dead, a lot of these people that they had kidnapped, basically, and stolen, they came from traditions like most people in the world that really honored their dead. When somebody died, they were buried, there was a ceremony, they were treated with respect. How one handled their dead was extremely important, even in wartime. Like, you didn't just abuse bodies. I mean, they obviously did have some fairly brutal practices, like dismembering people here and there in various countries around the world. But in general, in these places, the dead were treated with respect, even when they were your enemy. So to them, seeing their brethren just tossed overboard like garbage was also a huge shock. Mm-hmm. And just like, what? Like, who are these evil monsters who have like captured us, who treat the dead like this, who treat humans like this, who do this? Like, what is going on? I can't imagine how horrible that must have been.
Yeah, and and this is not even the worst of it. It keeps getting worse. So just heads up, everyone.
Yeah. Now, of course, the crew is also in danger of catching those diseases that spread among the slaves because diseases spread. That's a thing they do. And many of the crew did die as a result. However, the newly enslaved people died at just massive, massive rates. As many as 20 to 50% of captured people would not survive the journey. And when the governments that funded these passages and the initial sort of charters for these did start to put regulations in place that forced a slightly better conditions for the slaves, the reason they did it was to protect the crew, to protect the slavers, as they didn't want to be losing crew as they were shipping these bodies across the sea. That inadvertently did make it less likely that people who were being transported were going to die, but that was not the motivation of the people who were paying for those changes.
Right. Now let's go back to our ship, the São João Batista. About half of the kidnapped passengers had died due to the rough conditions when the ship was captured by English pirates, specifically a ship called the White Lion. The remaining 20-ish captives were taken to a port near the colonist settlement of Jamestown in North America. The people were sold to bidders, largely tobacco plantation owners who immediately saw the benefit of unpaid labor. I mean, at this point in time, colonists tasted blood, wine was too thin. So what ended up happening was slavery took off. All of a sudden, it became the new thing. It became this incredibly powerful incentive for plantation owners to want to buy more people because they didn't have to pay for labor.
Yeah, and I mean, as far as we can tell, the country was not headed in the direction of slavery. Arguably, it was headed away from it with them sort of to get rid of indentured servitude. But this ship shows up with a whole bunch of people who look very different from people that most of the people who lived in the new colonies had ever seen before. They're very dark skin, had different hair, different clothes, different language, all of that. And then they were told, like, these are people who are going to work for you for free now. And they were like, oh, okay, we could get used to this. And so now with a market of slaves in North America that immediately picked up from that one event, like we said, we can really trace it to this one ship that captured those slaves and took them to Jamestown, or the colony near Jamestown. With that one event, there was this new market. The ships began raiding and pillaging Africa, attacking and taking hostages to the tune of an estimated 6 to 7 million people just in the 1700s.
That's what we kind of keep going back to, is this thing is so hugely impactful to so many people. I mean, this is just in the 1700s, up to 7 million people.
Yeah.
And most captives were spread throughout Caribbean plantations to work on coffee and sugar plantations. And Britain was a world leader, as one does. They tend to excel at these things, I would say. They were a leader in the slavery trade, and it continued on after Charlemagne. However, by 1807, the British had passed an act abolishing slavery and making all work around slavery illegal. This pissed off so many aristocrats who had amassed a fortune in wealth on the backs of enslaved peoples. But they all got over it and found other ways to swindle money away from people, because that's what people do.
Yep. So further, after the British Abolition Act of 1807, the British began using their navy to actually actively stop slave ships from bringing captured people across the Atlantic to the Americas. Until about 1867, when it sort of reached its peak, the British operations on the west coast of Africa estimated to have captured 36 slave ships and released an estimated 200,000 men, women, and children who were being brought to America to be sold as slaves. So trying to make up for the damage that they did, the incredible large amount of damage.
It's a start, I guess.
Yeah.
Although slavery was very common and growing increasingly common in the United States, few laws had codified and instilled slavery or the parameters of slavery. So basically, there was very little around this to protect the people that were involved in this situation, except for the people who were making money. And even then, there was very little on that front. So this ended in 1662, when Virginia wrote into law that a child would be born free or into bondage, depending on the condition of the mother. Thus, generations of enslaved people could be born right on American soil. Essentially, if the mother was an enslaved person, the child born to that mother was an enslaved person from birth.
Which is essentially what really kicked off this is now the legal precedent for slavery in the United States, saying that we are acknowledging that this is a thing and we're ensuring that it continues as long as possible. Because one might have argued before that the people who were brought to the Americas were slaves because they were captured from another place, but that people born on American soil were people who were American citizens. Like, that was definitely an argument that someone could and almost certainly did make at the time. And so to prevent that from being the case, they said, no. We're going, if they're slaves, everyone that comes after them is slaves. Their skin makes them slaves. They're slaves.
Right.
And Virginia enshrined that idea into law. So we'll talk, I think, let's get into the kind of work that slaves did once they became slaves or were born into slavery.
Right. So although an enslaved person might be assigned to a variety of roles or tasks, most enslaved people worked on farm plantations. Initially, those folks, the enslaved folks, would work on indigo, tobacco, or rice farms from Chesapeake Bay in Maryland all the way down to Georgia. And so you found that that's a large area to cover.
The fact that it was as far north as Maryland, which I knew that it was kind of spread around and all over, and what they consider the South is a lot further north than you might think. But yes, that seems like it covers a huge amount of land.
Yes.
Now, in 1776, the United States, many people who listen to this may know that the United States gained...
Nobody in Florida does.
That's right, yeah. The United States formally gained its independence from England. Up until that time, it was still technically like an England branch, if you will.
Yeah, we were like the Scranton branch of Dunder Mifflin.
Exactly right. Yep, that was the perfect comparison. So HQ is over in England, but Dunder Mifflin, America version, is over here. Mm-hmm. And in 1776, we said, no more. We declared our independence and signed that into law. And so we were now independent from England. And many people in the North, for whom slavery was really not particularly important to their economy, saw slavery as a form of oppression similar in their minds to what they had just liberated themselves from with the English monarchy. Thus, the North sought to abolish slavery in the North.
Right. Yeah, because this is a really important thing too. As we started to establish the United States, so much of the conversation was as the colonies and the states started to develop, federal overreach versus states' rights and all that stuff became a huge thing. And ultimately, when people talk about the Civil War being about states' rights, they're really talking about states' rights to own slaves. So that's kind of just so we have that. But let's dive into this.
Yeah, right as we get into that, just as you were saying, like this really did divide the country in sort of what were the important things that made the North different from the South. Because we said the North wanted to abolish slavery in the North, and we'll get to that in a moment. I mean, this really did divide the country. And like that divided the country, we're going to divide this podcast and insert some ads. Okay, we are back. We were talking about the rift that formed in the United States once the North decided to abolish slavery. And because the North decided to abolish slavery.
That doesn't mean that the North was anti-racist at all.
No.
No.
And largely, they were specifically focused on it only being banned in the North, as we'll talk about.
So there was a major divide politically in the United States between states that abolished slavery and states that depended on it. The South wanted more political power to keep and expand the practice of slavery. Enslaved Africans made up nearly half of the entire population of the people in the southern states, and the people of the South thought that those people should count for the purposes of having representation in the government. So there's some interesting things. The compromise was to write into the Constitution of the United States that people had the right to possess, quote, any person held to service or labor, i.e. enslaved people. Thus, Africans, although definitely not having the right to vote, were allowed to be counted as 3/5 of a person for the purpose of calculating how many seats at the government table the South would get. So, to simplify that, essentially, if a person was enslaved and they were working on a plantation, they counted as 3/5 of a person, which meant that in the South, because there were so many enslaved people, they got more votes, they got more representation, they got more government kind of power in the South because of the 3/5 law.
Even though this was supposed to be a representative government, and the 3/5 of the person meant that those bodies were being counted toward the number of elected officials that would represent the South, they were not hiring representatives for those 3/5 peoples. That is to say that the people who were enslaved, although being used to calculate seats for representation, were not getting representation, which I think is so transparently a power grab that
100%.
Like I don't understand like how that even made it through the government, but that's where they're at, I guess.
It's people in power keeping power. I mean, you know, some things just never change, you know?
Right. Okay, but we're getting into it now. So as we said, at the time, they were really farming things like tobacco and indigo and stuff like that. But in 1793, as the story goes, and most people have heard, Eli Whitney developed the cotton gin. And this massively reinvigorated the agriculture of America, exclusively the South. And this became the primary export of the South. In fact, 3/4 of the world's cotton for the whole world came from the American South in the United States. And although this amounted to incredible wealth for the Southerners profiting from slave labor, this was not restricted to profits in the South. Northern textile factories erupted and were massively profitable from the cotton that was obtained by the slave labor in the South. Northern banks granted loans to purchase lands for growing cotton in the South. Northern insurance companies insured slave owners for their slaves and their products as property. And the Northern textile factories even sold those cotton-made clothes back to the South to clothe the enslaved people who had picked the cotton that became their clothes. So it became this very intertangled web where people in the North benefiting from slavery nearly as much as the people who were running the plantations in the South were. Although they liked to preach that they were all doing the right thing, there was a lot of people who were specifically saying one thing and doing another so they can make a buck. And many of them were not even a lot of people in the North were not abolitionists, and I think a lot of the people who were making money on this were in that camp of pro-slavery, just not in the North.
So basically, just to be clear, if that wasn't abundantly clear already, some form of the United States economy and the people that are involved, everybody directly benefited from slave labor.
Except the slaves.
except the slaves, yeah. And just to be clear, because that's a thing that's happening in Florida right now, slavery did not benefit black people, did not benefit enslaved people. It did not, simply put. And we just kind of saw a tip of that iceberg here. Now, slave labor in the South was so profitable that it actively prevented the development of other industries. I mean, this is so wild to think about how big this industry was.
Yeah.
There were few factories or manufacturing operations or technological innovations in the South, including railroads, because why would they need to?
Yeah.
They had people power.
Right. There was a sort of silver lining there in that because they didn't develop these better factories and they didn't have a good railroad system, that was part of what made it very difficult for the South in the Civil War. They had very little technology or infrastructure. The North was much better supplied for the Civil War fight when that took place, which likely contributed to the victory.
As opposed to now, which the South is just a technological and intellectual beacon of the world.
Right. It's a full 180 they made.
You know?
And thinking about what this looked like, there were obviously massive plantations with hundreds of slaves, but really most people who owned slaves only had 3 or 4 slaves, and most people did not own slaves at all, although a lot of these people would rent slaves when they could afford to help with some of the labor they were doing. But I think a lot of people think of there being these massive fields that were just populated by slaves, and although those did exist on some plantations, most places where you'd find a slave-owning family, they had 3 or 4, and that was actually fairly uncommon still because most people didn't own any slaves.
Right. Most of the nation's founders saw slavery as a necessary evil. So essentially they're saying, we need this right now. Most people recognized the horribleness of it all, but did not see a way to end it and preserve the wealth and success of the country. And Thomas Jefferson wrote, quote, "As it is, we have the wolf by the ear, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is in one scale and self-preservation is in the other," end quote. You know, not that Thomas Jefferson's the greatest person to quote when it comes to slavery, but that is specifically kind of understanding that he was like, well, we need this, and he was directly benefiting from it.
Yes, he was. Another one that I forgot to put in here in the notes is George Washington also had many slaves, and George Washington was apparently a real sneaky son of a bitch about this. So there was a law in the North, maybe it was part of Virginia, I don't remember where it was, but wherever it was, the law was that if a slave worked in a particular area for it was 9 months or something like that, then they automatically gained their freedom. And they basically had this saying that it was not cumulative, it was consecutive. If they worked in this area for this amount of time, then, and maybe, I think it was actually longer than that. I think it was 3 years or something, or 5 years. But if they worked in this period of time, then they would automatically gain their freedom having worked there for such a period of time. So George Washington, who had multiple estates, what he would do is he would, as soon as slaves got up to the point that they were about to gain their freedom, he would move that entire group of slaves across state lines to a different estate, and the ones at that estate across to the other estate, so that he could force them to stay enslaved for much longer. He apparently had one slave in particular that was going to be granted to his niece or something like that, who apparently was just horrendous nightmare of a person, and the slave ran away, and they were so surprised. They're like, why would the slave run away? They're like, we've always treated them so nicely. I'm like, well, first of all, you forced them into labor well beyond what they should have actually had to go through, and second of all, you're trying to force them in a position of someone who treats them very badly. This should come as a surprise to nobody who has eyes, ears, and a brain, but apparently that's where we're at. So anyway, long story short, George Washington really worked hard to ensure that he could severely and permanently restrict the freedom of his slaves by circumventing the law, I guess you will.
And also, too, just to kind of illustrate how ungreat he was, everybody was taught when we were younger that he had wooden teeth. And he had dental problems, but many of his teeth were ivory. They were animal teeth that were shaved down, but some of his teeth and his dentures were actually from enslaved people that he owned. So just to keep that piece of information in mind when we talk about the founding fathers and their merits, if you will.
Yeah, actually, I just heard recently it was not that uncommon back at the, like, I want to say the 1800s, but probably before that, when they needed to make false teeth for people, they got them from the young people who had died recently. A lot of times it was on battlefields, but they would like, well, it makes the most sense to make replaceable teeth out of real teeth. And where are you going to get real teeth that are not already rotted? Someone who's fairly young. Where are you going to find someone who's fairly young whose teeth you can salvage? Soldiers.
Sure.
And so people were walking around with dead soldiers' teeth in their mouth, which is pretty gross to think about.
Yep. Yeah. It's a whole thing. Maybe one day we'll just do a whole episode on teeth. I'm sure people will really be stoked about that. Ugh. Now, people who needed to maintain and expand slavery to continue to build generational wealth struggled with the cognitive dissonance of it all. The kind of like, we know it's bad, but we benefit from it. And they started to try to talk themselves into believing that slavery was good for those enslaved folks. Sound familiar? 2023, Florida? Ugh.
Right.
The masters fed them, sheltered them, clothed them, and took care of them in their old age. So the slave owners must be good people, right? That's kind of what they were trying to talk themselves into.
Yes. So these deluded slave, I'm going to say owners in scare quotes there, therefore could paint themselves as benevolent and paternal and opposed to the poor working conditions of the free labor in the North, in which the business owners had no responsibility to the well-being of their employees. The business owners didn't clothe them or shelter them or feed them or anything of that nature. And so these people in the South were sort of talking themselves into believing that they were being kind to their enslaved people, even though they obviously had taken away their freedom. They were feeding them, and that made it okay. And so I think as a quick thought exercise, you can think about if your employer stopped paying you, but you were forced to work for them anyway. Oh, and they could beat you anytime they wanted or do anything else they wanted to you.
Sure.
But they would give you food from now on. Would you take that deal?
Probably not.
I would not.
Nope. I say probably not. There's a very small chance that I would. Like, it would have to be very, very, very little. And even then, it would not be good. Now, John C. Calhoun, in a speech on the Senate floor, said, quote, "I hold that in the present state of civilization, where two races of different origin and distinguished by color and other physical differences as well as intellectual are brought together, the relation now existing in the slave-holding states between the two is, instead of an evil, a good, a positive good," end quote. I swear to God, that could just be Ron DeSantis right now talking on the Senate floor.
Honestly,
that's not an exaggeration. That's where this is going right now.
Yeah, and John C. Calhoun was unfortunately not some whack job way off in the field that people didn't listen to. He was, of course, the Secretary of War from 1817 to 1825, the Vice President from 1825 to 1832, and the Secretary of State from 1844 to 1845. So this guy who was sitting here telling us that slavery was a good thing was like in a position of power for several positions of power for a long time.
Yeah. And further, people justified slavery by referencing the practices of the Greeks and Romans, as well as passages from the Bible. The curse of Ham was a common one. And here we go. Quote, "And the sons of Noah went forth from the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And Ham is the father of Canaan. These are the three sons of Noah, and of them was the whole world overspread. And Noah began to be a husbandman, and he planted a vineyard, and he drank of the wine and was drunken, and he was uncovered within his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father, and told his two brethren without. And Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it upon both their shoulders, and went backward and covered the nakedness of their father. And their faces were backward, and they saw not their father's nakedness. And Noah awoke from his wine, and knew that what his younger son had done unto him. And he said, Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren. And he said, Blessed be the Lord God of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant. God shall enlarge Japheth, and he shall dwell in the tents of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant. And Noah lived after the flood 350 years. End quote. I would like to say, if I saw my dad naked, I don't think I should be an enslaved person for the rest of my life. I think that would suck. That's not cool.
Yeah, that's a ridiculous way to go about that. Another verse, Apostle Paul's epistle to the Ephesians, is like a tongue twister, 6:5-7 says, quote, Servants, be obedient to them that are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling and singleness of your heart, as unto Christ, not with eye service as man pleasers, but as the servants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, with good will doing service as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatsoever good thing any man doeth, the same shall he receiveth of the Lord, whether he be bond or free." End quote. Apostle Paul repeated the same sentiment almost verbatim in Colossians.
So what ends up happening is people will take something that, like a holy book, and they will literally interpret it, and then they will turn it into something that ends up being quite harmful for people. And this is one of the justifications for why slave owners would continue to keep enslaved people. It was like, hey, this is in the Bible. Look, Noah did it.
Yeah.
Except it was his own kid who saw him naked because he was too drunk to cover himself, which is like, they didn't talk about that part. They're like, see,
Right.
The Bible says slaves are fine, instead of being like, it was Noah's fault, which, is kind of ironic.
Right. And also super cherry picking, like what parts they're going to be like, let's focus on these couple of passages here that make our position look legitimate.
Yeah. Which is, consistent for, extremists.
It's true.
Further, they argued that Africans were naturally genetically inferior to people with pale skin and must be subjugated for society to work. Not enslaving black people would destroy society and upset the natural order, they argued. That sentiment you have heard time and time again in different forms across different decades. I mean, you hear terms like super predator describing black folks in the 70s and 80s when people were like creating like a black scare. You hear the war on drugs, which was specifically used to target low income black neighborhoods and incarcerate black folks. I mean, this particular narrative has changed time and time again, but the sentiment and the theme is the exact same. It's just another way to describe how people in power are going to keep those who they consider lesser than in a subjugated form.
And, I might argue tongue in cheek, saying like, did unenslaving black people lead to the destruction of society and upset of the natural order? Clearly not. And yet I could almost guarantee you that is like the next stump speech we get from Ron DeSantis or someone, because they start to say like, our country is off track, we've destroyed the natural order, we've upset society, and things of that nature. And then they point maybe all the way back to, see, it all happened when we undid slavery.
Yeah.
And I don't think that is a stretch to say, like, because, and normally I would have said that jokingly, like I would have joked that would be an argument they would make, but they're like, they just keep marching backwards through time to this point in some of their arguments. So I think that it would not surprise me at all to hear them invoke the same rhetoric to justify why they should come into power, is because the thing that they said would happen happened, which is we've destroyed society by giving people equal rights, when I would completely disagree, saying that things have gotten better and better since people have gotten more and more rights, and that taking those rights away will make things significantly worse.
Right.
But maybe some disagree with me on that, and I'm just going to say you're wrong.
That's a good stance.
Now, although we've been talking about sort of the history of slavery up to this point, what we haven't really done yet is unpack what slavery was like, what it consisted of, and the conditions of slavery. So I think we need to get really clear about what slavery was. And I think that is a really good time for us to go ahead and pause this conversation and pick that up in part 2, because we have so much to cover still. So I think we can end that one here. And as we come to the close of this, I always like to say, if you appreciate what we're up to today and would like to support the show any way that you can do so non-financially by leaving us a rating and a review and subscribing. You can do it financially by joining us on Patreon. If you do that, then you get access to all kinds of bonus content, behind the scenes stuff, early releases of stuff, ad-free stuff, that sort of thing. If you don't want to join us on Patreon, you can instead support us financially by picking up some merch. The people who've already supported us on Patreon, and we are just eternally grateful to their help and for just being who they are and continuing to allow us to do the things that we do, includes Mike M, Megan, Layla, Mike T, Justin, Kim, Joshua, Brad, Stephanie, Olivia, Brian, and Ashley. Thank you all so much for your continued support of the show and what we're trying to do here. My team of people includes writing and fact-checking from Shane and myself, editing and audio production from Justin, and our social media coordinator is Emma Wilson. Now, we do like to recommend some things as we are closing out a discussion. So is there anything that you need to say before we get to our recommendations, Shane?
This is generally a heavy topic, and like we said, we wanted to try to treat it with grace and dignity and respect for the folks that this is impacted, because we know how big this impact is. So we hope that you don't take the recommendations as kind of like a slight on that topic or like trying to wash away. Like, we really think of this as like kind of a palate cleanser, because this is so tough, and sometimes you need to step away from a topic and just kind of regroup, process, and kind of absorb that information. So we're not dropping this in to kind of say, hey, by the way, here's some levity just because we are doing this as like this is something that we do on every show. But
yes,
just so you know, we're not trying to do this insensitively. We are putting this in a space where we say, you might need a little bit of a palate cleanser after all that.
Just to be clear, also, the recommendations that we give often are completely unrelated to the topic at hand. That is definitely the case today. But as you said, we like to try and end with something a little lighter. I mean, we do end every episode with this, but it helps, I think, allow us to end and go about the rest of our day.
Yes.
And understand, that we're not forgetting the things that we've talked about. We're not forgiving the horrible things that have happened. And we can also, as you said, bring a little levity to this. So anything else before we transition to our recommendations?
Nothing else.
All right, here is an ad break for you, and then recommendations. All right, we're back from that ad break, but I do have one more quick audio transition. It's one that we wrote ourselves. Well, Justin wrote it.
Recommendations.
Okay, I am recognizing a product for which I'm going to appear to be a shill, and I'm actually not getting paid for this product placement type advertising buzz marketing thing I'm doing, but I was convinced by the commercials. I went out and tried it, and I really liked the product, so I'm going to go ahead and echo that sentiment here like a shameless consumer. I'm recommending the product that is called Dawn Platinum Easy Squeeze, which is a kind of dish soap. It's as advertised. It just works really, really well. You don't need very much of it, and it's very effective. It cleans really well. And the bottle design, this is part of why I picked it up, is so that it always sits basically upside down. So the soap is just sort of always being pulled down by gravity toward the nozzle. But they designed it so it doesn't leak or drip at all. Like, it's actually really well designed. And so you just a little squirt of the soap on your dishes, and it really works super well. It cuts through pretty much everything I've put to task on it so far and done a pretty stellar job. Even things that I thought I had cleaned really well before, when I put the soap on it, they got even more clean. So I was like, okay, I'm down for this soap. So that is my shameless plug for this product that I just really like.
I love that. Well, I think that's the first time that we've had dish soap as a or just like a cleaning product. So good,
and possibly the last.
Maybe the last. Who knows? Unless we get a paid sponsorship, then Dawn, hit us up. We'll take some money.
Yeah, absolutely.
So my recommendation's a movie, and it's the new Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Mayhem movie that just came out.
Oh, the animated one.
Yes, it is so fun. So it's written by Seth Rogen and a couple other people. There's a bunch of writers on it.
Wow.
The animation style is really cool. It looks like it's animated as if storyboard sketches were kind of that's the entire art style.
Sort of stop motion.
And then there's scribbles where maybe lights or shading would go. Almost it looks like it's drawn quickly.
Okay.
But really cool. It's a really cool design.
Neat.
Now, the voice acting in it is incredible. So first of all, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles are all teenagers. They're actual teenagers.
Wow.
But the voice cast is bananas. So just to kind of give you an insight on this, Jackie Chan is Splinter.
Whoa.
Seth Rogen is Bebop. All the Ninja Turtles are actual teenagers. John Cena is Rocksteady. Ayo Edebiri is April O'Neil. She plays, I think, Sydney in The Bear, if you've seen that show.
I haven't, but you recommended it, and it is on my list.
Okay, good. Ice Cube is Superfly. Post Malone is Ray Fillet. Paul Rudd is Mondo Gecko. Let's see. Rose Byrne is Leatherhead. Giancarlo Esposito is Baxter Stockman. Maya Rudolph is Cynthia Umtron. Hannibal Buress is Genghis Frog. I mean, there are so many people in this movie. It's absurd. And it is so fun. Yeah, it's just a really fun, it's a fun movie. So it's a nice palate cleanser. They act like teenagers in it because, when you watch the old movies, they all act like they're a little bit more mature and grown up. They're very goofy in this one.
Fun.
They act like kids, and that's exactly what you would expect out of a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle movie. So it was fun, and it was good, and you should go see it.
Awesome. All right, cool. I like that recommendation.
Yeah.
All right, well, if you would like to tell us how awesome of a job we did, or you'd like to critique something that we did and do so constructively and kindly, you can write to us directly, info@wwd.podcast.com. You can also reach out to us on the social media platforms. Thank you all so much for listening today. Thanks again to our Patreon supporters. Thank you for recording with me, Shane. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we close it out for this week? And then we come back next week with part 2 about slavery.
Nothing else this time.
Perfect. This is Abraham.
And this is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.